Millionaire takes girlfriend out but is paralyzed when he sees pregnant ex-wife working as a waitress. David Clarke strode into the cafe with purposeful steps, feeling the warm sun filtering through the glass windows. The morning coffee ritual always offered him a sense of normalcy, something he cherished. He didn't like surprises, nor did he welcome situations beyond his control. After a turbulent period, all he wanted was to enjoy a quiet moment with Lily, his new girlfriend. They sat at a table near the counter. Lily, with her usual smile, began discussing her plans for the day. But David found his thoughts drifting. Something at the counter caught his attention. An unexpected detail, a presence that made his body stiffen and his stomach tighten. His gaze fixed on a woman moving across the room, balancing a tray in her hands. The movement was familiar. The way she pulled her hair back, the tense posture as she weaved between customers. He recognized that walk, that way of holding her breath before speaking. Olivia. The name whispered inside his mind, almost drowned out by the pounding in his chest. The world around him seemed to silence, as if all sounds had been sucked into a vacuum. Impossible. He couldn't be seeing what he thought he was seeing. But it was her, his ex-wife. And then David noticed something that froze his blood. Her rounded belly. She was pregnant. The shock hit him like an invisible punch to the chest. Time seemed to stretch, moving in slow motion as he struggled to understand what this meant. It had been almost a year since Olivia had left his life. Their separation had been abrupt, painful, and now there she was, serving tables in a modest cafe, carrying a child. Lily noticed the sudden shift in his expression. "David, what's wrong?" He didn't respond. His eyes remained locked on Olivia. She hadn't noticed him yet, or maybe she was deliberately ignoring his presence. David felt a crushing weight in his chest. For months, he had wondered what he would say if they ever crossed paths again, but nothing he had imagined could prepare him for this moment. Instinctively, he stood up. His steps were hesitant, like walking on unstable ground. With every step that closed the distance between them, a knot tightened in his throat. When he finally stood in front of her, Olivia looked up. Her eyes met his, nothing, no emotion, no nostalgia. Olivia's expression was cold, rigid, without a hint of surprise or hesitation. The silence that followed was unbearable. For a moment, David didn't know what to say, and then, almost without realizing it, his voice came out trembling. "Olivia." She blinked slowly, and in a measured tone replied, "What do you want, David?" The way she said his name carried a weight that he couldn't ignore. There was no sweetness, no longing, just an invisible wall between them. He swallowed hard. His gaze dropped to her belly, then quickly returned to her face. "You're—" "Yes." Her response was blunt, cutting off his question. For a moment, David couldn't breathe properly. His mind screamed with questions, but none of them had room to be voiced. He opened his mouth, but Olivia, unfazed, slightly raised her chin, an old gesture he knew all too well. "It's none of your business." It was as though someone had pulled the ground from under his feet. He blinked several times, trying to process the coldness with which she treated him. The Olivia he knew used to be intense, explosive, full of emotions she could never hide. But now she seemed invulnerable, untouchable. He struggled to find the right words. "I was just surprised." "Good for you." She held the tray tightly, as if it were the only thing keeping her from running away. "I'm working, David. I don't have time for this." That hurt more than he was willing to admit. Before he could say anything else, Olivia stepped aside and passed him without looking back. He watched her disappear through the cafe's back door. The conversation had ended before it even began. David stood there for a few moments, trying to collect his thoughts. What the hell had just happened? With heavy breaths, he returned to his table. Lily was staring at him with curiosity and a touch of impatience. Who was that? He took a while to answer. He could still feel the impact of that unexpected reunion. No one, he murmured, looking away. But deep down, he knew that lie wouldn't last long. Guilt crept in, settling inside him like an uncomfortable memory. For months, he had tried to move on, ignoring the mistakes of the past. But now, seeing Olivia there, with that belly carrying a child he didn't even know existed, he realized that their story wasn't as over as he had once thought. The taste of the coffee in his mouth turned bitter. David drove home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. The smell of coffee still lingered on his clothes, but the bitter taste of his encounter with Olivia was not from the drink. It was something else, something that spread through his chest, making it hard to breathe. He couldn't shake the image of her from his mind, nor the sight of her pregnant belly. A life she was carrying, one that he had no part in. When he parked in front of the building, he stayed in the car for a few minutes, staring at the dashboard. Lily had sent him a message asking if everything was all right. He read it, but didn't respond. How could he explain what he was feeling when he didn't even understand it himself? He made his way up to the apartment, weighed down by an invisible burden. The space was dark and silent. What once felt like a warm, organized home now seemed cold and lifeless. He kicked off his shoes, loosened his tie, but instead of collapsing onto the couch like he usually did, he walked to the kitchen. He needed a glass of water. That's when it all began. The silence around him wasn't just physical. It was an echo of the past. As he drank the water, he realized he had been in this exact moment before. In the dark, alone, drinking something after another exhausting day of work. But back then, he hadn't been alone. Olivia had always waited for him. Memories flooded in without warning, like a film playing on the empty wall in front of him. He saw himself coming home late, finding her sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket with a closed book on her lap. She pretended to be focused on the book, but David knew she was just waiting for him. "You said you'd be home earlier today." Her voice had always been calm, never needing to rise in volume to convey frustration. He, on the other hand, always had an excuse ready. "I had a last-minute meeting." The same excuse. Always the same. But the memory that haunted him now was different. Her birthday. The day he broke a promise he could never repair. He remembered it clearly. He had promised her they would do something special. He even made plans, swore to himself that he would leave work early. But when he looked at the clock, it was already past 10. He rushed home, carrying a cheap, hastily purchased cake. When he opened the door, he found the dinner already set. The table was arranged with the care only Olivia knew how to give. Plates carefully arranged, candles that had been extinguished after waiting too long to be lit. Her perfume still lingered in the air, but Olivia wasn't there anymore. He slowly climbed the stairs, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He found her in the bedroom, lying with her back to the door. "Olivia?" She didn't respond. He reached out to touch her shoulder, but she pulled away. No shouting, no tears, just silence, and that silence hurt more than any argument. David shut his eyes as he remembered that moment. He still wondered what would have happened if he had just dropped everything and stayed with her that night. Would it have made a difference? He took a deep breath and walked to the living room. He threw himself onto the couch, but instead of resting, he felt even more restless. The memories wouldn't stop. They never stopped. How many times had Olivia asked him to slow down? How many times had she tried to make him understand that he was there, but not truly present? David always had an answer ready. He'd tell her he was doing it all for them, that he was building a better future, that things would get easier later. But later never came. And then, one day, she gave up. The memory of the divorce hit him like a punch to the gut. David could almost smell the freshly printed paper when Olivia placed the documents on the table. He tried to argue, tried to tell her things could change, but her eyes were empty. "The problem, David, is that I don't believe in you anymore." That was all she said before signing. He tried to hold her back, begged her, told her it would be different this time. But it was too late. Now, sitting on that couch, staring at the ceiling, David felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. Back then, he thought Olivia was overreacting. That time would make her rethink, but time passed, and instead of bringing her back, it pulled her further away. And now, she was pregnant. Guilt spread through his body like slow poison. For the first time, he allowed himself to admit that he was the one responsible for everything. There were no coincidences, no outside forces. His choices had led them to this point. His phone buzzed. Another message from Lily. He glanced at the screen but didn't open it. "If you're watching this far, I'm sure you're liking it, so I want to ask you to subscribe to the channel." Olivia closed the back door of the cafe behind her, taking a deep breath. The shift had been long, and the weight of her pregnancy made every movement feel more laborious. The smell of coffee and fresh bread still clung to her clothes, but what she felt the most was the exhaustion weighing her down. The baby shifted gently inside her, as if reminding her that she wasn't truly alone. She touched her belly, whispering a quiet, "It's okay," as though trying to convince herself. The night breeze felt like a relief as she walked to the bus stop, clutching her purse close to her chest. The cold air contrasted sharply with the warmth of the kitchen, but it didn't matter. Inside, all she felt was fatigue. Her feet ached, her legs felt heavy, and her head throbbed with worry. The customers had been demanding as usual, and the manager hadn't made it any easier, but she couldn't afford to complain or falter. The bus arrived, its brakes screeching as it came to a stop. Olivia climbed aboard slowly, carefully gripping the handrail. She found a seat by the window and rested her head against the glass, letting her eyes wander over the streets of Los Angeles. The streetlights flickered like urban stars, and the movement of people outside seemed distant. Couples walked hand in hand, groups of friends laughed together, and life carried on as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed for her. She got off at her stop and walked to her small apartment in the city center, feeling the weight of each step. When she entered, she locked the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, taking a deep breath. The silence of the apartment enveloped her, dense and absolute, making the space feel even colder. She made her way to the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, staring at the sparse contents. Some fruit, a bit of milk, leftovers from the previous night's dinner. Every expense had to be accounted for: rent, medical exams, food. Everything was part of a complicated equation where mistakes were not an option. She sat at the table and rubbed her belly, feeling the baby move once more. He needed her strong, determined, unbreakable. She always reminded herself of this when doubt started to creep in. But some nights, even that certainty wasn't enough. David. His name came to her like a forbidden whisper in her mind. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push it away, but it was impossible. No matter how hard she tried to convince herself that he was no longer a part of her life, he should have been there. He should have known. But relying on David again? No. She wouldn't make that mistake. He never knew how to balance priorities. Work always came first, promises were always empty, and the moments she needed him were always postponed for when things got better. But the later never arrived. She had grown tired of waiting, and now, with a child on the way, she couldn't afford the luxury of illusions. There was no room for disappointment. She stood and walked to the bedroom, feeling the sting in her eyes. The apartment felt even smaller at night, as though the walls were closing in around her. She took off her shoes and lay down carefully, trying to find a comfortable position for her belly. The baby shifted again, as though sensing her unease. Olivia ran her hand over her stomach and smiled, despite the lump in her throat. "We'll be fine," she whispered. The words were for the baby, but also for herself. She repeated that phrase every night, like a mantra meant to push away the fear. But when the night fell and silence took over, the doubts returned. Had she made the right decision in pushing David away completely? Would he ever regret not being there? Would she regret not giving him a chance? She placed her hand on her forehead and closed her eyes, trying to quiet the thoughts. The past couldn't have space in her life anymore. She had to move forward, focus on the future, think about what was best for the baby. But part of her still wondered if the future would be any less lonely than the present. The nights were long, the apartment small, and his absence too large. David couldn't sleep. The night had been long and restless, filled with thoughts that circled in his mind without mercy. He tried to ignore them, tried to convince himself that moving on was the best option, but the image of Olivia wouldn't leave him. She was pregnant, she was alone. And as much as he wanted to respect her decision to push him away, something deep inside him screamed that he couldn't just walk away. The morning passed in a blur at the office, his attention nowhere near the meetings or emails piling up before him. The words from his co-workers seemed like white noise, voices without meaning, as his mind replayed the brief encounter at the cafe. Reports stacked up on his desk, but his focus was fixed on one thing: Olivia. The way she had looked at him, like he was just another customer, the exhaustion in her face. The way she gripped the tray with a quiet tension, her back slightly arched as she moved between the tables. Should he just forget about her? Pretend he hadn't seen her? The logical side of him said yes, that Olivia had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him. But guilt gnawed at him, growing like a shadow he couldn't escape. Since the divorce, he had always imagined he would move on without carrying the past with him. But seeing Olivia pregnant reopened wounds he hadn't even realized still existed. He grabbed his car keys and drove off without a clear destination in mind. He didn't plan what he would say or how he would approach her. He just let his instincts take over. When he parked near the cafe, he stayed in the car for a few minutes, watching the activity inside through the large glass windows. The morning rush was in full swing, customers coming and going, waiters moving quickly from table to table. And in the midst of it all, there she was. Olivia moved with precision, balancing plates, filling cups, smiling automatically at customers. But David could see beyond her mask. He knew Olivia well enough to recognize when she was pretending. This time, he wouldn't approach her. He walked into the cafe and chose a seat in the corner, far enough to stay out of her sight, but close enough to watch her. He ordered a coffee, but barely touched it. His gaze stayed fixed on her, studying every movement, the way her shoulders sagged with fatigue, the way, every now and then, she would rub her lower back as if trying to ease the strain, the occasional sigh between orders, as if she were summoning the strength to keep going. David tried to picture what her life was like now, waking up early, working long hours on her feet, doing it all alone. Who was helping her? Who was making sure she was okay? And when the baby was born, who would be there for her? The thought of Olivia facing these challenges alone filled him with unease. He knew she would never ask for help. Olivia had always been proud, always preferred to handle everything by herself, but that didn't mean he couldn't do something for her. When he finished his coffee, he took out his wallet and left some bills under the receipt. Enough to cover his bill and leave a generous tip. He didn't want her to know it was him. He just wanted to make sure she had a little more comfort, even if only in a small way. Olivia noticed the money when she cleaned the table. She frowned as she picked up the notes, then looked around, as if trying to figure out who had left them. Her gaze lingered on the door, but David was already outside, walking away before she could spot him. Later that day, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Her shift ended, and she walked home as usual, but the thought of the tip stayed with her. It was just money. Any customer could have been generous. But something about it felt strange. A feeling nagged at her, a sense of intuition that told her this wasn't a coincidence. The next morning, she went to her prenatal appointment. She had already calculated how much it would cost, counting every cent in her head. When she arrived at the reception to pay, the receptionist smiled and said, "It's already been paid." Olivia blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" "The payment was made in advance. Everything is settled. You can wait to be called." Her heart skipped a beat. Someone had paid, and it wasn't hard to guess who. She took out her phone with trembling hands, hesitated for a moment, then typed a short message. "Was it you?" The response came almost immediately. "We need to talk." Olivia's chest tightened. She didn't need any more confirmation. It was him, David. She closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of anger and something she didn't want to admit, relief. Part of her knew he would find out sooner or later, and that at some point he would try to get closer. But that didn't change anything. She didn't need his help. She didn't want to depend on him. And above all, she didn't want to relive everything she had tried so hard to leave behind. Olivia crossed the street with determined steps, feeling her blood pulse faster than usual. The phone was still in her hand, David's last message glowing on the screen like a silent challenge. "We need to talk," as if he had the right to dictate what should or shouldn't happen between them. As if, after everything, he could simply come back and decide to re-enter her life. She shoved the door of the cafe open with more force than necessary. The bell above the door jingled loudly, drawing the attention of a few customers. But Olivia didn't care. Her eyes scanned the room until they found him. David sat at a table in the corner, an untouched cup in front of him. He saw her immediately, and his expression shifted, from surprise to something more guarded, as though he'd known this moment would come. She walked toward him without hesitation. "What do you think you're doing?" Her voice was low, but laced with fury. David placed his cup down carefully and looked her in the eyes. "I just wanted to help." Olivia let out a short, dry laugh. "Help?" she repeated, crossing her arms. "You disappear, leave me to handle everything on my own, and suddenly decide you can make decisions for me. Who gave you that right?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. He didn't seem surprised by her reaction. In fact, he almost seemed prepared for it. "I know I don't have the right," he admitted finally. "And I know I can't change the past, but Olivia, when I saw you at the cafe, when I realized you were pregnant..." She raised her hand, cutting him off. "No, you don't get to say this is about you. It's not about you, David." The silence between them was heavy. David looked away for a moment before meeting her gaze again. "I made a mistake. I know I did. For so long I thought I was doing the right thing, prioritizing work, securing a future for the two of us. But in the end, all I did was push you away." Olivia clenched her fists. How many times had she waited to hear those words? How many nights had she wished David would finally see what he had done? But now that he was saying them, she felt nothing but anger. "If you think that admitting your mistakes now changes anything, you're wrong." He nodded slowly, accepting her rejection without arguing. "I don't expect it to change anything, and I don't expect you to forgive me right now. But I needed to do something." Olivia shook her head, exasperated. "The only thing you needed to do was leave me alone. I'm managing, I'm getting by. Do you think you can just show up, throw money at my problems, and think that fixes everything?" David's gaze faltered. He knew he shouldn't have paid for that consultation. He knew it only reinforced everything Olivia had always said about him, that he tried to solve everything with grand gestures without ever making any real change. "You're right," he said quietly. Olivia blinked, surprised. She hadn't expected him to give in so easily. "I shouldn't have done that without asking you first. I shouldn't have assumed you needed my help without checking with you." She crossed her arms, still skeptical. "So why did you do it?" David took a deep breath before answering. because I couldn't just stand by. For the first time, I saw the real consequences of my choices. And I don't want to be the guy who only shows up when it's too late. She stayed silent for a few seconds. Part of her wanted to keep fighting, throwing all her frustrations in his face. But another part felt something different. Not exactly trust, but a kind of hesitation she hadn't expected. David noticed it. "I know words aren't enough," he continued. "I can't ask you to believe me right now, but I can show you that I'm different." Olivia hesitated before stepping away. She didn't want to give him hope or herself, but for some reason, at that moment, for the first time in a long time, David didn't seem to be just saying what she wanted to hear, and that scared her more than anything. David felt the weight of his conversation with Olivia like a punch that still reverberated in his chest. He left the cafe with heavy steps, climbed into his car, and sat there with his hands on the steering wheel, trying to digest everything. He hadn't expected her to welcome him with open arms, but the way she had rejected him, the anger in her eyes, was a brutal reminder that words weren't enough. He couldn't just show up and expect her to believe that he had changed. Not knowing where else to go, he called Chris. He didn't need to say much. The tone in his voice was enough for his friend to understand. "Meet me at the usual bar," Chris had said before hanging up. David drove there, feeling an exhaustion that wasn't just physical, but mental. When he arrived, Chris was already sitting at a table in the corner, 2 bottles of beer in front of him. Chris was the kind of friend who didn't ask questions right away. He waited for you to talk, and David talked. He told him about Olivia, about the pregnancy, about his attempt to help and the crushing failure of that encounter. Chris listened in silence, sipping his drink. Only after a while, when David had finished, did he let out a sigh and lean forward, his forearms on the table. "And what did you expect, hermano?" he asked without sugarcoating. "That she'd smile, thank you, and take you back?" David lowered his head, frustrated. "Of course not, but I thought, I don't know, that she would see that I wanted to change." Chris shook his head. "Changing isn't just about apologizing, it's proving it with actions. You've spent years thinking work was more important than being there. Now you expect to fix it in a few days?" David stayed quiet, staring at the table. He knew Chris was right, but where could he start? How could he prove to Olivia that he truly wanted to be different? That's when Chris mentioned the support group. "And there's a group of guys who meet to talk about relationships, fatherhood, that kind of thing. I think you should go." David laughed, incredulous. "A support group? You think I need to sit in a circle and talk about my feelings?" "I think you need to stop thinking you know everything," Chris shot back. "It's not about talking, David. It's about listening. And from what I see, that's what you need most right now." The idea bothered him, but for some reason, it lingered in his mind. The next day, David found himself standing outside a small community center. The sign announced a meeting for men looking to improve their relationships and become better fathers. He almost turned around, but something inside him pushed him to go in. The room was simple, with chairs arranged in a circle. About 12 men of various ages and backgrounds were seated. The coordinator, an older man with a serene expression, began the meeting and invited everyone to share their stories. David didn't speak that day, he just listened. He listened as one man admitted that he had prioritized work over his wife and how he'd lost her because of it. Another man confessed that he had realized too late that he had never really been present for his children. Each story echoed within David, like hearing different versions of his own. For the first time, he saw his past from a different perspective. That night, as he left the meeting, he realized that his transformation couldn't be about Olivia. If he wanted to be a better father, a better man, he had to do it for himself. Otherwise, it would just be another empty attempt to fix something that had already been broken. In the following days, he kept attending the meetings. He didn't try to force encounters with Olivia, didn't send her persistent messages. He simply kept going, trying, truly trying to change. Olivia noticed. She began to notice small things. David started coming to the cafe, but he didn't try to speak to her. He'd get his coffee, sit in the corner, read a book, and leave without making eye contact. He stopped leaving generous tips, stopped trying to get her attention. It was as though he had accepted that her time was more important than his intentions. And as much as she didn't want to admit it, this made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. What did David really want? How far would this change go? And more importantly, how long would it last? The night was quiet in Olivia's small apartment. The only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall, each passing second more hypnotic than the last. She lay in bed, unable to sleep. The exhaustion from the day was heavy on her body, but her mind refused to quiet down. Despite how drained she felt, her thoughts wouldn't give her any peace. Then, the pain came. At first, it was a slight discomfort, a nagging ache that she tried to ignore. But within minutes it intensified, radiating through her belly in sharp waves. Olivia curled into herself, pressing her hands against her stomach as she struggled to breathe. Her heart raced. This wasn't normal. She was only 7 months pregnant. This couldn't be it. She sat up slowly, trying to convince herself it was just fatigue, something that would pass. But another contraction came, stronger than the first, stealing her breath away. Fear crept in like a cold shadow. She needed help. She needed to get to the hospital. But who could she call? She closed her eyes, searching for an answer she didn't want to admit. She could call a taxi, but what if she didn't make it in time? She could reach out to a friend, but none of them lived nearby. And before she could stop herself, her instincts took over. She grabbed her phone with trembling hands and scrolled until she found the name she hadn't thought about in months. David. The phone rang twice before he answered. Olivia. His voice was filled with surprise and concern. She tried to speak calmly, but the pain of the next contraction made her voice falter. I think it's time. I need to go to the hospital. The silence on the other end lasted less than a second before David responded. I'm on my way. And the call ended. On the other side of the city, David dropped everything and rushed out without even grabbing his jacket. The cold night air hit his face as he jumped into his car and started the engine. His heart was pounding in his chest, his mind racing with thoughts he didn't want to entertain. Something was wrong. Olivia wouldn't have called him unless it was serious. He sped through the empty streets, ignoring the speed limit. Nothing mattered except getting to her. When he finally pulled up to her building, he saw her standing on the sidewalk, holding her belly and breathing in short, ragged gasps. He rushed to her side. Let's go, he said, supporting her carefully, but not in a hurry. She didn't argue. She didn't have the strength to. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. Olivia squeezed her eyes shut every time another contraction hit, her fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. David kept his eyes on the road, gripping the wheel with white knuckles, feeling utterly helpless. It's going to be okay, he murmured. We're almost there. But he knew, deep down, that in that moment, words weren't enough. When they finally arrived, the nurses rushed to her side, guiding her inside. David tried to follow, but one of them stopped him. You'll need to wait here. He nodded, but every second felt like an hour. Finally, a doctor came out to speak with him. David held his breath, his chest tight with anxiety. She's having preterm contractions, the doctor explained. It's not active labor yet, but we need to keep her on complete bed rest to avoid complications. David nodded, his mind spinning. Is she going to be okay? If she follows the recommendations, yes. But she needs support now. Those words echoed in David's mind as he was finally allowed to see her. Olivia lay in the bed, visibly exhausted, but still carrying that defiant expression she always wore. When she saw him walk in, she turned her face away, avoiding his gaze. "You can go now, David. I'm fine." He approached her slowly, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "I'm not going anywhere," she sighed, impatient. "I don't need you here." "I know," he replied, his voice calm, "but I want to stay." There was a moment of silence between them. Olivia could have insisted he leave, but for the first time, she didn't have the strength to keep fighting. She was tired, she was scared, and as much as she didn't want to admit it, it was a relief to have someone there. David noticed. He didn't say anything more. He simply reached out, offering her his hand, hesitant but unwavering. For a long moment, Olivia didn't respond. But then, as if all her resistance had melted away from pure exhaustion, she let her fingers slide over his. It was a small gesture, simple, but it was the first time she hadn't pushed him away. The first light of morning filtered through the curtains of the hospital room as Olivia opened her eyes. The weight of the previous night still lingered on her body, and the memory of the pain, the fear was stuck to her skin. She felt weak but grateful. The baby was fine. That was the most important thing. She took a deep breath, savoring the faint scent of disinfectant mixed with the weak coffee drifting in from the corridor. A nurse entered, carrying a clipboard and a professional smile. "Your tests are stable, Olivia. We can discharge you, but you'll need complete bed rest. No exertion or stress, okay?" Olivia nodded, though she knew it would be difficult. Work was her only source of income, and staying still wasn't in the plans. But what bothered her even more was the man sitting in the chair beside the bed, his elbows on his knees, a serious look on his face. David. He hadn't left her side all night. From the moment he had held her hand in the early hours of the morning, he stayed there, watching over her with a quiet determination. Now, as the nurse delivered the discharge news, he looked up, first at her, then at the nurse. "I'll take her home." Olivia sighed, closing her eyes for a moment before responding. "I can take a taxi." "You can," he agreed calmly. "But you won't." There was an undeniable firmness in his voice, but it wasn't demanding. It wasn't an imposition. It was a quiet certainty, as though he knew he wouldn't let her face this alone. Olivia studied him for a moment, trying to find something in his expression that would give her the excuse to refuse, but she found nothing. "This doesn't change anything," she murmured. "I know." Not long after, David helped Olivia out of the hospital. He opened the car door gently, waiting for her to settle in before getting in himself. He didn't ask questions, didn't push her to talk. He simply drove, allowing the silence between them to stretch out, filling the space without pressure. When they arrived at her apartment, David parked and got out of the car first, going around to open her door. Olivia eyed him warily before reluctantly accepting his hand to get out. Inside the apartment, the air was still, the familiar scent of lavender mingling with the faint smell of old coffee from the kitchen. David took in the space, noting the pile of dishes in the sink, the folded clothes on the couch, and a grocery list hastily scrawled on the table. "I can help with the chores," he said, as Olivia carefully slipped off her shoes. "Do the dishes, get groceries, whatever you need." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "David, if you think you can suddenly walk into my life like this and act like we're together again, you're sorely mistaken." He breathed in deeply, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not trying to force anything, Olivia. I just want to make sure you and the baby are okay." She crossed her arms, watching him closely. "If you really want to be a part of his life, you need to understand that things will be on my terms. So tell me what to do, Her gaze faltered for a moment, as if she were considering something, but she didn't speak right away. "Don't impose yourself. Don't make decisions for me. Don't try to fix everything with money or grand gestures." David nodded. Understood. Instead of pushing further, he picked up the grocery list from the table, glanced at it quickly, and left without another word. Olivia frowned, wondering what to make of his willingness to leave without arguing. Why had he accepted that so easily? In the past, David would have tried to fix everything with a speech about how he was doing what was best for them. But now he just listened. About 40 minutes later, David returned with bags of groceries. He set them down on the counter. "You forgot to write down the milk," he said, placing the items on the table. "And I got chamomile tea. The nurse said it helps with relaxation." Olivia watched him unload the bags without invading her space. He put away what needed to be put away, left the rest on the counter, and began washing the dishes. She crossed her arms, observing his every move. "You don't need to do this." "I know," he continued without rushing, without expecting anything in return. And it was then that Olivia realized something. For the first time, David wasn't trying to prove anything with words. He was simply doing. And even though there was still a long way to go before she could trust him again, at that moment, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the urge to push him away. Time passed quicker than Olivia expected. The final weeks of her pregnancy were a whirlwind of emotions, challenges, and quiet transformations. David continued to keep his distance when necessary, respecting her boundaries. But he was always nearby. He didn't push, didn't demand anything, just did what was needed without expecting recognition. And as much as Olivia tried to convince herself that his presence didn't matter, deep down she knew it did. But now, none of that mattered, because the pain was unbearable. It started with a mild discomfort, a nagging ache in her lower abdomen that came and went. She tried to ignore it. After all, the doctors had warned her that this could happen. But when the pain intensified and began to come in sharper waves, Olivia knew there was no more time to ignore it. The baby was coming. She sat on the edge of the bed, breathing deeply, trying to remain calm. She grabbed her phone and opened her contacts. Her finger hovered over David's name for a moment. She could call a taxi or ask a friend for help. But in the end, she did the only thing that felt right in that moment. She called him. The phone barely rang before he answered. "Olivia?" His voice was urgent, filled with alarm. She tried to steady her breath, but another contraction hit and she winced, unable to speak for a moment. I think it's time." The silence on the other end was brief, but heavy with understanding. David's voice came through immediately. "I'm on my way." The call ended. David dropped everything, rushing out of the office, not even bothering to grab his jacket. The cold air of the night hit his face as he jumped into his car, starting the engine with shaky hands. His heart raced, his mind racing through worst-case scenarios he didn't want to consider. Olivia had never called him unless it was serious. He pushed the car harder than necessary, speeding through the empty streets of Los Angeles. Nothing mattered, except getting to her. When he finally reached her apartment, he saw her standing outside, holding her stomach and struggling to breathe. He ran toward her. "Let's go," he said, helping her into the car without rushing but with urgency. She didn't argue. She couldn't. The ride to the hospital felt like a lifetime. Olivia clenched her eyes shut with each new contraction, her hand gripping the fabric of his shirt. David kept his eyes on the road, squeezing the wheel, feeling helpless, knowing he couldn't take her pain away. "We're almost there," he murmured, his voice trying to offer comfort, even though he knew it wasn't enough. When they finally arrived, the nurses quickly took charge, leading her inside. David was about to follow, but one of the nurses stopped him. "You'll need to wait here." He nodded, but every second felt like an eternity. Minutes later, one of the doctors came out to speak with him. David stood up quickly, holding his breath, his chest tight with fear. "She's having premature contractions," the doctor explained. "It's not full labor yet, but we need to keep her under observation to prevent any complications." David nodded, trying to process the information. "Will she be okay?" "If she rests and follows the instructions, yes, but she needs support right now." The doctor's words echoed in his mind as he was allowed to finally enter the room. He walked slowly into the sterile white room where Olivia lay, visibly exhausted, but with that same hard expression on her face. When she saw him, she turned her head away, refusing to meet his gaze. "You can go now, David. I'm fine." He pulled up a chair and sat beside her, watching her closely. "I'm not going anywhere." She sighed, impatient. "I don't need you here." "I know," he said, his voice calm, "but I want to stay." There was a moment of silence between them, thick with unspoken words. Olivia could have insisted he leave, but for the first time she didn't have the strength to argue. She was tired, scared, and despite everything, having someone by her side was a relief. David noticed. He didn't speak further. He simply reached out, offering her his hand, gently but firmly. For a long moment, Olivia didn't respond. But then, as if the weight of all her resistance had melted away in exhaustion, she let her fingers slide over his. It was a small gesture, simple, but it was the first time she hadn't pushed him away. The days following Noah's birth were a blur of sleepless nights, bottles, diapers, and absolute exhaustion. The baby had strong lungs and made sure to use them at full volume. Olivia, though accustomed to handling difficulties on her own, felt a level of fatigue she had never known before. Every time Noah cried, it felt as though a part of her was torn between the need to care for him and the overwhelming tiredness that weighed on her body. She wanted to handle everything, feeding him, calming him, making sure nothing was missing. But it was impossible. She wasn't just Olivia anymore. Now she was a mother, and David was there. This time he wasn't watching from the sidelines. He wasn't offering empty promises. He was truly present. He got up in the middle of the night without her asking, took Noah in his arms, and walked him around the apartment, speaking softly to him. When she forgot to eat, he'd leave a plate of food on the table, wordlessly. And when Noah cried non-stop and Olivia was at her breaking point, he would simply take the baby from her arms and say, "Go rest. I'll take care of him." At first, Olivia hesitated. Trusting him wasn't easy. Each time David took on a task, she felt tense, watching from a distance, waiting for the moment when he would give up, when he would walk away once the routine became too much. But that never happened. David was learning. He didn't know how to hold a baby properly the first time he tried. He struggled to make the bottle right, spilling milk all over the counter as he muttered to himself. The first time he bathed Noah, it was a disaster, resulting in a crying baby and a soaked, frustrated father. But he kept going. He asked questions, watched tutorials on his phone, made mistakes, and kept trying. And with every small victory, Noah seemed to accept him more. One night, when Noah's crying woke them both again, Olivia dragged herself out of bed, her eyes heavy and her body begging for rest. But before she could reach the crib, she saw that David was already there. He was holding Noah, rocking him gently as he paced slowly around the room, whispering soft words to calm the baby. Noah was still sniffling, but he was slowly quieting in his father's arms. Olivia stood in the doorway, unnoticed, watching the scene she had never thought she'd see, and for the first time she felt something different. Not anger, not distrust, just a quiet, almost imperceptible relief. The next morning, as Noah slept, David was in the kitchen making strong coffee. Olivia appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, her arms crossed. He noticed her, but didn't speak right away, waiting for her to make the first move. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly, her voice still a bit hoarse from the night's lack of sleep. He stopped what he was doing, but didn't seem surprised. "I know." The silence between them stretched for a moment, broken only by the sound of the spoon stirring in the coffee cup. "It's not easy to trust you, David," she continued, her voice lower than she intended. He set the spoon down and turned to face her. "I know," he repeated, "and I don't expect it to happen quickly. But I want you to know that I'm here because I want to be, because I need to be." She looked away, her gaze falling to the floor. His words were sincere, and they made her uncomfortable. Because deep down, a part of her wanted to believe him. "You still have a lot to learn," she muttered. David smiled faintly, a soft and understanding smile. "Then teach me." Olivia didn't respond. She just turned and walked out of the kitchen, but deep down she knew this wasn't just another empty attempt. For the first time, he was genuinely trying to learn. In the days that followed, David didn't try to force anything. He simply did. He went out to buy supplies before Olivia needed to ask. He cleaned the apartment during the rare moments when Noah slept. He washed the dishes without drawing attention to it. If Olivia noticed, she didn't comment. But David could tell she was watching him more closely than before. Then, one morning, something unexpected happened. David was sitting on the couch, with Noah resting in his arms. The baby was staring up at him with those wide, curious eyes, and David, still getting used to holding something so fragile, stared back at him in silent awe. And then, without warning, Noah smiled. It was brief, a small, spontaneous gesture, but it was real. A simple, unguarded smile that shone like a ray of light in the exhaustion of the past few days. David froze, as if afraid to breathe and ruin the moment. Then, a smile spread across his face, and his eyes lit up with emotion. "Hey, did you see that?" He looked at Olivia as if sharing something incredible. She was nearby, folding some baby clothes. Her eyes shifted from Noah to David, and for a moment she didn't know how to react. "Yes," she replied simply. David turned back to Noah, his face still filled with wonder. "That was for me, wasn't it?" Olivia felt a pang in her chest. Not sadness, not anger, just something different. Maybe. David didn't need her to say it out loud. He already knew. And Olivia, as she watched the scene before her, realized something. Things weren't perfect. There were still scars between them. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel anger. She didn't feel fear. Just a strange, unexpected relief. Days passed, and little by little, the routine between Olivia and David began to feel more natural. It wasn't like before, when every interaction between them carried tension and unspoken words. Now, without even realizing it, they started to function as a team. Olivia didn't ask for help, but he was always there. When Noah cried in the middle of the night, David would rise before she even needed to wake him. When she stepped out of the shower, the baby was already fed, changed, and content, and Olivia couldn't help but notice the small victories. But it was a fragile balance, built on a past filled with wounds that had yet to heal. David had learned to anticipate her needs. If Olivia was exhausted, he would step in without asking. If he noticed she needed time for herself, he would offer to stay with Noah, but he never crossed any boundaries. He never made her feel obligated. He did what he did because he wanted to, because he needed to prove, above all, to himself that he wasn't the man who had once let her down. This consistency was something Olivia hadn't expected. Though her mind insisted on remaining vigilant, her heart began to soften. Over time, David's presence in the apartment didn't feel as strange. At first, she would tense up every time he held Noah, as though waiting for him to mess up. But as time went on, she realized that he knew what he was doing. He still made mistakes. He put a diaper on backwards once, spilled milk in the kitchen, and hummed out of tune to calm Noah. But what was most surprising was that he didn't give up. And that made her think. One afternoon, as Noah napped in his stroller beside the couch, Olivia was folding baby clothes at the table. David sat on the floor, carefully folding washcloths, and for a moment his concentration was so focused that Olivia couldn't help but notice. "You're folding them wrong," she commented, taking one of the towels and fixing it. David raised an eyebrow, looking at her with mild amusement. "As long as they're clean, I don't think it matters." "It does matter," she said, not looking up. He watched her for a moment, considering her words before speaking. "Do you still don't believe I'm going to stay, do you?" She paused, the fabric momentarily forgotten in her hands. "I see that you've changed," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "But I can't just ignore everything that happened before." "I know," he replied softly. "And I don't expect you to forget. But I want you to know that I'm not here just for Noah." That made her stop completely. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. "What do you mean by that?" David took a deep breath before answering. "I mean that I care about you, Olivia. I know I was an idiot before, and I know I hurt you. But that doesn't mean I'm here just because of our son." The silence between them stretched out, thick and heavy with the weight of his words. Olivia looked away, her gaze returning to the baby clothes in front of her. "I don't want you to pressure me," she whispered. "I won't," he promised. "I just wanted you to know." His words hung in the air, lingering long after she left the kitchen, leaving him there, wondering what she truly felt. He didn't push her. He knew better than that. He had to give her the space to come to terms with everything on her own. Days passed, and the moments between them became less tense. Conversations began to flow more naturally. David kept caring for Noah, and every now and then, when Olivia watched him with the baby, there was a warmth in her chest that she hadn't expected. It was different from everything she had imagined. David still wasn't perfect. He still made mistakes. But he was there, he was present, and that, in itself, was more than she had ever dared hope for. One evening, after an especially exhausting day, Olivia was preparing tea in the kitchen when she heard a soft laugh from the living room. Curious, she peeked through the doorframe and saw David sitting on the floor with Noah in his lap. The baby was staring up at him, giggling, and David was making silly faces, trying to make him laugh more. "You're the little man of the house, aren't you?" David teased, tickling Noah's tummy, and the baby let out a few happy coos. Olivia felt her lips curl into a smile before she could stop herself. It was such a simple, quiet moment, yet it filled her with something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of peace. And it was then that she realized something. She had been waiting for anger, distrust, fear, but now, seeing David with Noah, seeing how much he had changed, she felt only something different, something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. She didn't have all the answers yet. The past still existed. The scars still remained. But for the first time, she allowed herself to think that maybe there was a way forward. Maybe together they could rebuild something, slowly, carefully, but something real. And just like that, with Noah giggling in his father's arms, Olivia felt a flicker of warmth in her heart that she hadn't felt in a long time. That morning, David watched Olivia as she gently rocked Noah in her arms, soothing him from his soft murmurs. He had learned to recognize that sound, Noah's little grumbles, the kind that signaled curiosity more than discomfort. The baby was awake and alert, his tiny eyes full of wonder as they took in the world around him. David smiled, watching them. It had been a few months since Noah was born, and each day brought its own challenges. But there were moments, like this one, when the weight of everything, The sleepless nights, the uncertainties, the fears faded away. "What do you think about going out for a bit?" David suggested, trying to sound casual, though there was a certain excitement behind his words. "Maybe a coffee?" Olivia looked at him, raising an eyebrow, her expression skeptical. She adjusted the blanket around Noah, making sure he was comfortable. "You want coffee?" she asked, glancing up at him as though trying to gauge his intentions. "Really?" He smiled, a little unsure but hopeful. "At that cafe. You know, the one where we first saw each other again." Her eyes flickered with recognition. The weight of their past settled between them. That cafe, the place where everything had changed, the place where the foundation of their new reality had started to form, though neither of them had known it at the time. The silence between them lingered for a moment. Olivia hesitated, but then, after a deep breath, she stood up, carefully settling Noah into his stroller. "All right, let's go." It wasn't a clear yes. It wasn't an agreement to make everything perfect again, but it was a step, a sign that perhaps, just perhaps, they could start over, together. The walk to the cafe was different from the last time they'd made the journey. That day, Olivia had walked alongside David with a heavy emptiness in her heart, the space between them filled with pain and uncertainty. Today, the air was lighter, though not perfect. There was still tension, still the weight of the past. But there was also something new, something more hopeful. David pushed the stroller gently, walking alongside Olivia. They didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of understanding, a shared recognition that they were both carrying the past. But now they were walking towards something new. When they entered the cafe, the familiar jingle of the door's bell sounded in their ears. The memories of the first time they'd been here came rushing back, but this time it felt different. This time they weren't just two people meeting unexpectedly. This time they were a family, walking through life, step by step, together. They chose a table near the window, a quiet spot where Noah could nap in his stroller. David quickly ordered 2 coffees, and Olivia adjusted the blanket around her son as she settled in. It was a simple moment, but it was full of meaning. As the coffee arrived, David lifted his cup, glancing over at Olivia. She raised hers, meeting his gaze. There was no need for grand speeches, no need for promises. The silence between them spoke louder than words ever could. They had been through so much. They had hurt each other, they had healed, and now, here they were, starting again. "To new beginnings," David said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. Olivia smiled softly, a small but real smile, the kind that said she was beginning to believe in the possibility of a future. She lifted her cup, her eyes meeting his. To new beginnings, indeed. As the cups clinked together, a small sound that echoed their quiet hope, Noah stirred, letting out a soft cry as he reached out toward his mother. Olivia immediately stood, picking him up with practiced ease. David watched her, a warm feeling spreading through his chest as he observed how naturally she moved, how her strength and love flowed effortlessly. For the first time, David truly understood what it meant to be present, to be a part of something bigger than himself. He wasn't just building a future, he was building a family. And no matter how hard it was, no matter how many challenges they would face, he knew this was where he was meant to be. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, Olivia felt a spark of something she hadn't felt before. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she was no longer afraid to face it, because now they would face it together. And for Olivia and David, that was enough.